The Wizard of Oz, the Classic Edition by L. Frank Baum, illustrated by Charles Santor. The Cyclone. Dorothy lived in the midst of the great Kansas prairies with Uncle Henry, who was a farmer, and Aunt Em, who was the farmer's wife. Their house was small. There were 4 walls, a floor, and a roof, which made one room, and this room contained a rusty-looking cooking stove, a cupboard for the dishes, a table, 3 or 4 chairs, and the beds. Uncle Henry and Aunt Em had a big bed in one corner, and Dorothy a little bed in another corner. There was no garret at all, and no cellar, except a small dark hole dug in the ground, called a cyclone cellar, where the family could go in case one of those great whirlwinds arose, mighty enough to crush any building in its path. It was reached by a trap door in the middle of the floor, from which a ladder led down into the small, dark hole. When Dorothy stood in the doorway and looked around, she could see nothing but the great gray prairie on every side. Not a tree, not a house broke the broad sweep of flat country. The sun had baked the plowed land into a gray mass. Even the grass was not green, for the sun had burned the blades until they were the same gray color. The house was as dull and gray as everything else. When Aunt Em came there to live, she was a young, pretty wife. The sun and wind had changed her too. They had taken the sparkle from her eyes and the red from her cheeks and left them a sober gray. She never smiled now. When Dorothy, who was an orphan, first came to her, Aunt Em had been so startled by the child's laughter that whenever Dorothy's merry voice reached her ears, she looked at the little girl with wonder that she could find anything to laugh at. Uncle Henry never laughed. He worked hard from morning till night. He was gray also, from his long beard to his rough boots, and he rarely spoke. It was Toto that made Dorothy laugh, and saved her from growing as gray as her surroundings. Toto was a little black dog with long silky hair and black eyes that twinkled merrily. Toto played all day long, and Dorothy played with him and loved him dearly. Today, however, they were not playing. Uncle Henry sat upon the doorstep and looked anxiously at the sky. Dorothy stood in the door with Toto in her arms and looked at the sky too. From the far north they heard a low wail of the wind, and Uncle Henry and Dorothy could see where the long grass bowed in waves before the coming storm. There now came a sharp whistling in the air from the south, and as they turned their eyes that way, they saw ripples in the grass coming from that direction also. Suddenly Uncle Henry stood up. "There's a cyclone coming, Em," he called to his wife. "I'll go look after the stock." Then he ran toward the sheds where the cows and horses were kept. Aunt Em dropped her work and came to the door. One glance told her of the danger close at hand. "Quick, Dorothy!" she screamed. "Run for the cellar!" Toto jumped out of Dorothy's arms and hid under the bed, and the girls started to get him. Aunt Em threw open the trap door in the floor and climbed down the ladder into the small dark hole. Dorothy caught Toto at last and started to follow her aunt. When she was halfway across the room, there came a great shriek from the wind, and the house shook so hard that she lost her footing and sat down suddenly on the floor. Then a strange thing happened. The house whirled around 2 or 3 times and rose slowly through the air. Dorothy felt as if she were going up in a balloon. The great pressure of the wind on every side of the house raised it up higher and higher until it was at the very top of the cyclone. And there it remained and was carried miles and miles away as easily as you could carry a feather. It was very dark, and the wind howled horribly around her, but Dorothy found she was riding quite easily. After the first few whirls around, she felt as if she were being rocked gently, like a baby in a cradle. Hour after hour passed, and slowly Dorothy got over her fright, but she felt quite lonely, and the wind shrieked loudly all about her. At first she wondered if she would be dashed to pieces when the house fell again, but as the hours passed and nothing terrible happened, she stopped worrying and resolved to wait calmly. At last she crawled over the swaying floor to her bed, and Toto followed and lay down beside her. In spite of the swaying house and the wailing of the wind, Dorothy soon closed her eyes and fell fast asleep.